our sponsorship of Rochester Reads, and specifically Jason Mott's visit to Central Library possible. Please join me in welcoming Shamika Fusco to our podium. Shamika was part of the book selection committee who was responsible for inviting Jason Mott to be part of the Rochester Reads program. And Shamika is an RPL librarian and Lyle branch supervisor. She will be introducing Jason Mott. Shamika.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is with great pleasure and honor to be standing before you today, as I was given this incredible opportunity to welcome our special guest. Sometimes opportunity knocks at the 11th hour of the 11th month and in the year of 2022, but it can knock. I am a huge believer of signs and numbers, so when I was given this wonderful opportunity last night, I could not pass it up. Reading has allowed me to escape, disconnect, made me feel as if I were traveling, but for free. I love that we can use our imagination to take us just about anywhere that we want to go. And as a former children's librarian, I have performed many story times, so today I choose to share my experience about this book by way of storytelling. Now, usually I would get you all to start clapping and whatnot, but we're going to save that for later, okay? So, 'twas the night before this Wednesday, yes, this Wednesday yesterday, that there was yelling in my house. "Ma, is this the poop of a rat or a mouse?" "No, Mari, it's a sunflower seed. Go clean your room." It's been a hell of a year, people, especially as a parent of a teenager. Adulting is so ghetto. At any rate, back to my story. All summer, I've traveled with this book in my backpack. It's gone from patios to bistros to Halifax and back. I really do mean that. I went to Nova Scotia a couple weeks ago. I promised myself I'd be better at self-care, read a little bit more, create boundaries, and do more than my fair share. But honestly, I'll say, damn, it's been a hell of a year. But there's something about reading that consumes your day. Jason Mott, you've been like Calgon. Please take me away. I resonate with Soot, captivated by his story. Will I live to see the day Black people rejoice in their glory? Can you see me? Do I see me? As I look around this place, I can still count on two handfuls the librarians that look like my face. The gospel song goes, "No matter how high, no matter how high I get, I still be looking up to you." Though intended to be sung for my higher power, imagine the feeling of a person like me, seeing a person like me in successful spaces and places. I appreciate people like Jason Mott that dive and thrive into spaces and places that reveal truths and create irritability and discomfort. Many times in my life, there has been success, but it's been uncomfortable, and sometimes it gets lonely. But that's a story for another day. Furthermore, representation matters. Do they look and sound like me? When I look at a future generation, I want them to know that it's we that they can be. So without further ado, I want to introduce you to the author that has been seen, interviewed, and mentioned on talk shows all across America, and last year's winner of the National Book Award for Fiction. Please welcome the author of Hell of a Book, Jason Mott.
Thank you all so much. That was literally the best intro I think I've ever had. And I think the funny thing is, so I just met her like 5 minutes ago and she was back there and she was really nervous and she's like, "I'm not sure if I can do this and I'm gonna freak out up there." I think she's that pool shark where like you go into the pool hall and she's like, "Oh, I'm just my first time playing, I don't know how to play. Let's put some money on it for fun." And then you walk out, with just shoes, that's all you got left. But thank you all for coming out. I've been having a great time here in Rochester. It's my very first time here, and I'm loving it, quite frankly. I'm having a good time. So the way that my events typically go is I will talk about the book, how it kind of came into being, some of the backstory behind it. Because if you have read the book, the backstory of how it made will actually inform a lot of what the book is as you read it or as you have read it. And if you have not read the book, then the backstory will give you some unique things to see as you're reading through it. So it's a win-win for everyone. And then after, I do that for like 30 minutes, and then I'll open up to question and answer, which is probably my most favorite part of the whole thing, because I've talked about this book a lot for the last year, so I know the spiel that I'm going to give, but I never know which questions you guys have and what you want to know about. That becomes truly fun for me. So I will begin with a brief reading. I think sometimes I do, sometimes I don't read, but I think I want to read today. I don't read for very long, so don't worry. Like, there's a phenomenon that we're like, from a very young age, we are taught to fall asleep as people read to us. Yes. So I don't want to trigger that in the crowd. So I read for, maybe 2 or 3 minutes or so, and then we start talking a bit more. And for those who don't know, Hell of a Book is the story of an author on book tour. And as he's traveling around the U.S., he's just written his first book, and it is a very big book. Everyone that he meets tells him, it is such a hell of a book. And that becomes his catchphrase almost. And as he's traveling, he encounters this 10-year-old boy, who he simply calls the Kid. The Kid keeps showing up in all these different cities that the author is traveling to, and becomes a bit of a mystery as to who this kid is. And as the author is trying to unravel that, there's a secondary story arc about this 10-year-old boy in southeastern North Carolina named Soot. Soot has very dark skin. In fact, he is called Soot by the bullies because of his dark skin. And Soot's narrative is one that begins to, try not to get too many spoilers away, but it begins to explore the discussion of policing and police violence in America, just as the author's narrative starts to kind of blend into that same space as well. So that's the kind of the rough synopsis of the book. And as I said, I'll give you guys a brief reading and then start talking a bit about where this all came from. So this section is regarding William, Soot's father, and it kind of gives you a glimpse into a moment that he's having and some things he's trying to talk about with his son, but he's struggling to have this specific discussion. William could see what was happening to his son. The boy's smile faded a little more each day that he came home from school. It wasn't the history lessons that were to blame, though they were difficult and intense. History still was one of those things that could be partially compressed, pushed down into the recesses of logic, barred from feelings. No, it wasn't the history, but the current events that were slowly weighing on his son. Each day, there was a new news report about someone who looked like him being shot and killed. Each day, his son saw someone arrested, locked into prison. Each day, the tide of bad things swelled up a little more around him, clutching at his lungs, threatening to pull him under. Each day, William wanted to talk to his son about it all. Each day, he wanted to sit down with the boy and tell him, this is how the world is. And then, he imagined, with that modest introduction, he would start into the reality of his son's life. He would talk about his son's skin color and what it meant. He would talk about all of the people who had come before and looked like him and all the things that had happened to them. He would talk about how the rules were different. He would talk about reality instead of the fiction that he had been sold. He would say to his son, treat people as people, be colorblind, love openly, love everyone. And then in the same breath, he would have to say to his son, but you will be treated differently because of your skin. The rules are different for you. This is how you act when you meet the police. This is how you act growing up in the South. This is the reality of your world. William would one day have to say all these things to his son, and many, many more. And with each word, his son's heart would break. With each word, his son would be capable of a little less love, capable of a little less imagination, of a little less life. It was the bonsai of a child, his own child. And because William couldn't bring himself to take away his son's optimism any faster than the world was already taking it away, he did not have this particular talk with his son. He only preached love and equality and the idea that the world could be a fair place. And when his son asked him about why a boy his age had been shot and killed by a policeman somewhere halfway across the country, William did the best that he could with answering, by not answering. It's hard to say why that type of thing happens, William replied. He and his son were in the living room, waiting down the old couch and trembling in the glow of the television, as the news rattled off the grisly details of the boy's shooting. He had been out for a walk when the police stopped him. Then, somehow, events conspired that ended with the boy lying dead on the sidewalk. The news showed the sidewalk where the boy's body fell. It was unremarkable concrete that now wore a rather unremarkable stain, as if someone had spilled a bottle of syrup and walked away without cleaning up behind themselves. It's not something that happens all the time, William said. He rubbed his thumb and forefinger together as he spoke, a habit that went back to his own childhood. Something about the motion calmed him, and right now, as he spoke to his son about the boy on the television, he wanted to be calm. What was the boy doing wrong? Sid asked. Nothing, William replied. He cleared his throat. I mean, from everything that they've said so far, he wasn't doing anything wrong. There will be an investigation, I'm sure, so let's try not to make too much of a call until we find out more about this. William nodded in affirmation. It was important to teach his son not to jump to conclusions, especially when faced with something like this. A person had to take news like this slowly. They had to measure it out, moment by moment, and not let it get the better of them. That was the way to survive the tide in the long run. You couldn't just drink it all in and let it take control of you. That was how you lost your optimism. That was how you lost your hope. And William wanted his son to have hope for just as long as he could. Thank you. So, as you can tell, very serious, heavy, dramatic stuff. But the book is also filled with comedy and tomfoolery and shenanigans, if you want those. So as I mentioned, I will talk a little bit about how this book came into being, because being that it is about an author on book tour, and here I am, an author on tour, touring about the book that's about an author on tour. It's very dramatic and very meta. So this essentially started, well, the narrative of this, the book itself didn't start until about 2013, 2014, but the narrative behind the narrative kind of began in about 2008. So I was a non-traditional student. I kind of skimmed through high school, didn't go to college immediately, started doing other things, but I eventually found I wanted to be a writer. So I went and got an undergraduate degree in fiction, and I went right back and got a master's degree in poetry. So what do you do with a master's degree in poetry? You go work at Verizon Wireless answering phones for a call center. Yeah, amazingly enough, no one's beating down your door to analyze 16th century Italian poetry. It's just not what they do. They do want you to answer phones for people that are pissed off about their phone bill. Because no one calls a cell phone carrier to say, I'm having a great day, just wanted to share that with you. They call you to yell about things and to find out the husband's cheating and all kind of stories like that. And so I worked there for 4 years. And to kind of give it a bit more flavor, even though we were in Wilmington, North Carolina, because of how Verizon routes their calls, I actually handled New York Metro. So it was mainly New York City predominantly, so just pissed off New Yorkers all day. Hopefully not you all. I'm going to be nice and give you the benefit of the doubt, and hopefully it was not you calling in, screaming at me. If it was, shame on you. If not, thanks for being a good person. So I worked there for 4 years, and I had really good writing habits. One of my mentors told me that a long time ago. And what that looked like was every year I would write a new novel. I would write a whole new manuscript. I would start it in late spring, write it over the summer, and edit in the fall and winter. And then come the new spring, I would send out query letters to agents trying to find an agent, trying to sell the book. For 3 years, I did this religiously. Every year I sent out a new book. And every year they rejected it, just shot it down. And it's not because agents are dumb and don't recognize greatness. It's because the books were terrible. I can say that looking back on them now because at the time I thought they were the most brilliant books ever written. I read them now and it's like, was I drunk? Did I have a head injury? None of this makes any sense. And that's the journey of writing. So after about 3 years of this, I hit kind of an emotional low point. And this is where the story becomes very Hollywood for a moment. I was just in a really bad headspace regarding all of it because again, I had been in undergrad for 4 years trying to learn how to be a writer. I went to graduate school for 2 years. So for 6 years, I had committed my life to being a better writer, being an author. And then it wasn't happening. For 3 years, I was writing manuscripts and getting them rejected. One day on lunch, I was sitting, I had just sent out a whole new thing of query letters, trying to find a new book, and I was certain that it would not happen. I wouldn't find an agent. So one day on lunch, I'm sitting in a car with one of my good friends, and we're just eating lunch and staring at the Verizon building, wishing it would burst into flames the way that you kind of wish. And if you've never had a job where you wished it would burn down, you've never had a bad job. And of course, I just want to say, in this fantasy, no one dies in the fire, just the building burns to the ground, that's all. So we're sitting there kind of, wishing the building would burn, and it didn't. And I told my friend, I said, at what point in your life do you have to admit to yourself that you're not this thing over here that you'd always hoped you would be? That you're this thing over here. And this thing over here is fine. It's a great human being. It's a great way to go through life. It's fine. But it's not the thing that you really dreamed about since you've been a kid. And my friend, being the smarter of the two of us, she said, shut up, you idiot. She said, just keep writing and something will happen. And literally about a week later, I got an email from this agent who I queried about my new book. And she said, oh, the book sounds interesting. I would love to read it. I sent it to her, and lo and behold, she becomes my agent. So it was a very Hollywood, Rocky goes down, and suddenly he's okay. So we spent about 6 months revising it and polishing, getting ready to send it out to publishers. Because the way that publishing works is you send out your manuscript to a lot of different publishing houses in New York. And then hopefully, the dream is they all read it really quickly, they fall in love with it, and they just fight over it. They throw money at you and try to get you to sell the book to them. That's the goal. So we sent it out on a Thursday in May 2011. And we just kind of, I was a nervous wreck the entire weekend because my book's out in the world. And my agent had told me, she said, it can happen fast, it can happen slowly, or it may not happen at all. It's really hard to predict, so we're going to hope for the best. So Monday, I'm at work. My agent calls me, and I go on break, and I call her back. And I said, hey, what's going on? And she goes, great news. We have a preemptive offer on your novel. And what that means is someone has read the book, and they want to throw money at you first to get you to sell it to them. And I was like, cool. But obviously, the first question I want to know is, how much money are we talking? And so I asked her, I said, how much money is it? And it was not quit your job and move to Aruba kind of money, because I would be there right now as opposed to here. But it was quit the job that you hate to go do the thing you've always wanted to do and maintain your exact same current standard of living, which I think is what we all really want out of life. So I was very happy. I was ecstatic. And my agent could hear it in my voice. And she said, do not quit your job. I was like, why would you think that? She goes, so there's 3 reasons why you do not quit your job. She goes, first of all, it was just an offer. We have not accepted anything. We've got to negotiate. It's just an offer. She goes, secondly, even if we accept the offer and we sign the contract, it takes generally about 6 months for your money to actually show up. So you need to have, she said, you need to exist. You got to pay bills. You got to have health insurance. You need the job that you have. And the third reason, and this is a little known fact about publishing. So when you sign the contract, you sold the book to your publisher. Typically, it's about a year to 15 months before it hits the bookstores, before anyone really sees it. Now, the book does not go to the printers until about 2 months before your release date. So the entire 10 to 12 months before that, if your publisher ever decides they want to, they can cancel your contract without really explaining why. And they want their money back. Yeah. So you do not want to spend your advance before your book goes to the printers. That's a little known secret of publishing. So I was talking to my agent. My agent tells me all this, and she goes, I've handled authors before. She goes, do not quit your job. I said, okay, you're absolutely right. Thank you. And I hung up with her, and I walked to my supervisor, and I said, I'm out of here, and I walked out. And never went back, thankfully. Thankfully, it worked out for me, but so there's that. So then things started happening very quickly. May 2011, we sold the book. June 2011. So like a month later, we sold the TV rights. My agent had like a film guy who went to LA and like shopped it around. This film, ABC liked it. They were like, we want to take it and turn it into a TV series. It was like terrific. The book comes out August 2013. From May 2012 to 2013 to August 2013. So a year and some change. The show got greenlit. It was filming the pilot. They filmed the pilot. They were already filming the first season. They were like 5 episodes in. Like, they kind of chart how quickly things happened. The book came out August 2013. The TV show hit the air September 2013. That is how fast things happen. So I had like the Willy Wonka golden ticket where everything just falls into place. And so the book comes out, and I got to go on a book tour, which I didn't even really know was a thing that people did. I knew authors sometimes came to town, but I never thought of it as like a tour concept. So when I say book tour, people often envision 5-star hotels in New York and, you know, limousines and, you know, strippers and cocaine, whatever you would want to envision for book tours. They envision it as this very glamorous thing, and it is not that thing at all. It's more akin to being in a band and you have to travel for your band. So a day in the life of the book tour is you wake up at 5 a.m., oftentimes in a city that you do not even know where you are. You're just in a city in a hotel. You rush downstairs, you jump in a cab, you go to the airport, you catch a 7 a.m. flight to some other city, you land at about 9 a.m., you get to that city. If you're lucky, you go do interviews. You go to radio interviews, TV interviews, newspaper interviews. Anyone that will take you, you show up at their door and you answer questions about your book. Then, when that's done, which is usually around 12 or 1 or whatever, you do a stock signing. Stock signing is you find every bookstore in that city and you go and you ask them, do you have my book? I will sign all the copies that you have. You go to the back of the store, you sign everything they have, you get into a car, you go to another bookstore, you sign everything, and that is your entire day. At about 6 in the evening, you get to talk to a wonderful crowd, which is actually the best part of the evening. The best part of the tour is like talking to people about your actual book. So you get to do that for like an hour, hour and a half. Then you go back to your hotel, you get there maybe 8 or 9. You play email tag with your editor, all the emails you missed throughout the day. Maybe you do phone interviews in preparation for the next day. You go to bed at like 11, and you wake up the next day at 5 a.m., and you restart the entire cycle. When the return came out, I was on the road for 10 days. I was home for 36 hours. I was gone for 8 days. I was home for 24 hours. I was gone for another 8 days. Like, that is what a tour is. It's terrible. So the story I always tell, which kind of like encapsulates what a tour actually is. It was about 3 weeks into the tour for the return, and I was getting tired. Can you imagine why? I contacted my publicist. I was on the West Coast. I contacted my publicist. I said, can I take a day off? Like, just give me a day to sit and recharge. And she goes, no, you're doing great. You're moving books. People are coming out to your events. Like, you got to keep going. And of course, being your first novel, you don't want to say no to anything your publisher asks because they might send you back to Verizon. And you're like, God, I don't want to do that. So you say yes to everything. Like, they had told me to get in a cage and fight a gorilla. I'd be like, sure, give me a mouth guard, let's do it. So I was like, okay, fine. So I hop on this flight. I was in San Francisco flying up to Portland, I believe. Like a 9 o'clock flight, evening flight, it takes off, and I was fine. I fall asleep as we're taking off. I wake up at 30,000 feet. We're mid-flight. I woke up because my heart was racing and I had sweated through my shirt as I was sleeping. My heart is beating like 180 beats per minute. There's sweat dripping off my ears. Like, my body's in full panic mode. And I thought that I had this terrible fear that like the air conditioning had broken on the plane and we were all suffocating slowly and I had no one to know it but me. Of course that was not it. I look around, everyone else is fine, they're taking naps, living their best life. So I felt nauseous, like I was going to vomit. And you don't vomit on people as a rule, that's rude. So I said, well, let me get up and go to the bathroom and I can vomit in there. So I got up, I got 4 steps down the aisle, and the floor began moving. And I was like, that is very interesting. And of course, it was not the floor moving, it was me beginning to fall back as I began to pass out. And the last thing I remember before I blacked out, because I did completely black out, this guy was sitting on his aisle seat, and I remember him so clearly. He had like a little sweater on and some jeans, and his earbuds in, and he's just sitting there relaxing. And he looks up, and he sees me starting to go back, and he goes, wait, and he reaches for me, but his seatbelt catches him, so he misses the grab. The last thing I see, I fall back, I bang my head on the floor, everything goes dark. Next thing I know, there's like a bright light in my eyes, and I was like, oh God, I died. This is the tunnel of light that you see after death. And of course it was not. It was this flight attendant kneeling over me with a pen light saying, sir, do you know your name? Do you know where you are? So I was very embarrassed. They picked me up, they helped me to the back of the plane, and they laid me in that little small section where like the flight attendants work out of, that little narrow, cramped section. This lady comes out the bathroom, has to literally step over my body to get out. It's awkward for both of us. So I'm laying there, and I'm 5'11". This space is like 2'1". So I'm at this really cramped angle, and they gave me some orange juice. I'm sipping orange juice, and this lovely flight attendant is sitting there, and she's trying to keep me talking because I just passed out on a plane. And she goes, sir, do you have any health issues that we should know about? I said, no, I'm actually really healthy. I think I'm just really tired. And she said, well, why are you so tired? I said, well, I've been traveling a lot. She goes, well, why have you been traveling so much? I said, well, I'm actually touring for my new book. And she goes, oh my God, tell me about your book. So you can literally pass out from exhaustion from talking about your book and wake up pitching it to a new person. That is what book tours are. And the funniest part, of course, is like at the end of I'm getting off the plane and we're all deplaning and like we're walking out and the flight attendant's there at the door, as they greet you on the way out. And she goes, "Hey, I hope you feel better. And I might go buy your books." Like, might? All I get is a might. I literally passed out and I get a mite from one sale on the book. It's like, okay, fine. So that's what book tours are. So at the end of the book tour, I was talking to my agent and I said, I really got to write a book about an author-owned book tour. I said, people wouldn't believe some of the crazy stuff that happens. And my agent, being very smart, said, it's a terrible idea. No. And I was like, okay, that hurts a little bit, but fine. So I go write my second novel, and that one creates a new book tour, more travel. I finished that. My editor and my agent were all on a phone call, and they're like, what do you want to write next? I said, I would love to write about an author-owned book tour. And they both kind of high-fived and said, no, that's terrible. It's like, okay, fine. I write my third novel. A third book tour ensues. Another book tour ensues. And so after the third book kind of all happened, my publisher and I wound up kind of like splitting ways. Like nothing bad, we just kind of parted ways. So suddenly I had no contract. I could kind of pick and choose what I wanted to do. My agent and I were talking. And she said, hey, what do you want to write now? And I think you guys can guess. I said, I would love to write about an author-owned book tour. And my agent, I could hear her over the phone just kind of sigh and like, Jesus Christ. But I said, hey, don't worry. I said, I've actually been working on it. I've already started working on it for like the last few years. I kind of been cataloging some wacky adventures, and I got 150 pages of this author-owned book tour that I think is fun. And she goes, fine, send me the first 50 pages. Let me see what you have. So I send it to her. About 2 weeks pass. She emails me back. And the opening line of the email said, I am not impressed. She's a very honest lady. But this is where, like, when I tell the first part of this story, people must think, like, your agent's a moron. No, my agent is wonderfully brilliant, and she's great at what she does. And this is how I demonstrate how great she is. It said, I am not impressed, but who cares? She said, I am not your mother, I am not your gatekeeper. You can write about whatever you want to write. If you are passionate about this author-owned book tour story, if it is a story you want to tell and you need to tell, you don't need permission. Don't wait for me. Who cares what I think? Go write that. Go write it, send it to me, we'll figure out what to do with it, and just go do the thing you want to do. So it's like, okay, great. So mom gave me permission to go do what I wanted to do. So also, during this time period, there was the Freddie Gray incident in Baltimore, Maryland. For those who do not remember, Freddie Gray was a black man who was arrested by police officers. He was put into the back of a van and given what is called a rough ride. Now, the rough ride in this kind of context is the police put you into the back of this van, they drive fast, they brake hard, they take corners really sharply. Meanwhile, you're in the back of the van with your hands cuffed, behind your back, and they do not buckle you into your safety belt. So you are free to ping pong around the inside of this metal police van. And as a result of that, Freddie Gray sustained injuries from which he later died. The police were kind of brought up on trial, and then after that, they were kind of basically acquitted, and Baltimore turned to riots and protests for several weeks. So during this time, a friend of mine who lives in Baltimore, who is also a black male, a friend from college, what happened was every morning at 7 a.m., we had a mandatory phone call. It was like a standing date, essentially, where I would call him or he would call me at 7 a.m. And the first question I would always ask him is, how are you? Are you safe? How's your family? Because it was just a check-in to me. Because again, I'm watching the news, there's riots, there's protests, there's looting, there's violence, the cops, they're threatening to bring in the National Guard. It is a volatile place to live. And we would start this conversation about how are you feeling? How is everyone? Are you safe? He would tell stories of going to protests, being able to see the fires from several blocks from his house. It was a nervous time for everyone. So that was the first week or so we did that. Because for about 3 weeks we had these phone calls. After about the first week of that, it evolved into this discussion about how this was not the first time that we lived through this. I was 40-something, he's almost 40, and we started kind of recounting all the moments in our lives of living through this. Rodney King comes to mind as another big event. There's been so many of these events, so many of these moments across American history that we had lived through. And if we hadn't lived through them, our parents had lived through them, and so on and so forth. And we just kind of took stock of all these things and how it made us feel, and we talked about it a lot. So after about 2 weeks of that, if you can believe it or not, I was pretty depressed. It was a very heavy conversation to be talking about, and starting your day with this conversation for 3 weeks. And I told my friend, I said, I don't think I can talk about this anymore. I said, I think I'm just overwhelmed. I don't know what to do with all these thoughts and all these feelings. And my friend, being very smart, he said, hey, like, why don't you write about it? You're a writer. Write something. So I did. I started writing these very small pieces that were a mixture of memories and feelings and just general thoughts about all the things that were happening, combined with headlines that I saw, like currently headlines from the past and just my thoughts on those, combined with stories from my own life of being profiled by police, stories from my parents told about, living under segregation, all these types of stories. I just wrote like a whole stack of stuff, and none of it connected. It was just things. And I was trying to figure out what to do with that. It was all very heavy and depressing and sad. And I said, well, I want to make a book out of it, but I can't do this. Like, it's just too heavy. And my brain remembered, you got 150 pages of comedic stuff about an author on book tour. What if you took these two things and just mashed them together somehow and combined them? So I spent about a year and a half combining these two very disparate things to make this story. And I didn't know what it was. I told my friends, and I have because now that it's won the National Book Award, people say, you must have known you were writing such an amazing. No, I didn't. It was literally the worst book of my career, is what I told myself. And I told my friends. I was texting friends. I said, this is my magnum opus of failure. I will fail here more than I've ever failed before. Because to me, the book was doing too many things. Like, it was comedy of authors running naked through hallways, paired with kids being bullied on a bus, compared with sex dating stories, paired with kids being police violence and people being shot. And then there was Nick Cage woven in throughout all of that. So I told my friends, I said, no one's going to want this book. And so I finished the book. I sent it to my agent. I said, on the email, I said, I don't know what this is, but here it is. So she takes about a month to read it. She contacts me back, and she emailed me, and the email just said, we need to talk. And I was like, uh-oh, mom's mad. I was positive that the book was such an abysmal failure, she was going to just drop me as a client. So we get on the phone call. The first thing she says is, this is the best book you've ever written. Why didn't you write it years ago? Yep, there we go. So I write the book. It comes out. I'm on the Today Show. It does better than I ever kind of dreamed it would. And typically what happens is your book comes out, and you're busy for 3 months. As I mentioned, you're on the road doing all kind of cool stuff. You're promoting because your book's new. After about 3 months, all that excitement kind of trails off. And this is normal. People, move on to the next new book and things like that. But you get to kind of calm down. Your life settles. So that came out June of last year. So September-ish of last year, things were starting to settle down, and I was like, fine. And my editor emailed me on a Friday morning, and he said, hey, we need to jump on a Zoom call today at 10:25. I was like, that's a very exact time for a Zoom call, but sure. And I was kind of angry because I live in rural North Carolina, and one of the small towns, one of the many towns that still does not have high-speed internet. So for me to do a Zoom call, I literally have to drive 40 minutes to Wilmington, North Carolina, just to do a Zoom call. And I had done Zoom stuff for the book. So I was kind of pissed that my editor was going to make me drive 40 minutes to do this Zoom call, because he said he wanted to talk about the paperback that was coming out next year. And I was like, we can do that over the phone. I don't need to see you to do that. So I do the drive. I get there on the call. I'm angry. It's 10:25 a.m. And the first thing my editor says is, he goes, so this actually has nothing to do with the paperback. Sorry. He said, you've actually been longlisted for the National Book Award. And I was like, dude, it is too early to joke like that. What are you doing? This is a terrible joke. And he goes, no, I'm very serious about this. He goes, at 10:30, the news will be live to everyone. He goes, so you can Google yourself at 10:30 and see that you've been longlisted for the National Book Award. And of course I freak out. I'm in there doing backflips and just screaming and having a blast. And I was like, this is so amazing. I will never win, but this is absolutely amazing. So then they said, the finalists will be announced in October of this year. So October comes around. One day, my girlfriend and I were driving back from Louisiana, attending a wedding, and we're in the car, and she's driving. I'm in the passenger seat, and my phone rings, and it's a New York area code. And I do not answer New York area codes, because I worked at Verizon Wireless for 4 years, talking to pissed off New Yorkers. Gives me PTSD, quite frankly. And so it goes to voicemail. I call the voicemail, and it's this lovely lady named Ruth Dickey from the National Book Foundation. She goes, hey, I was calling to tell you you're a finalist for the National Book Award. So I started screaming and freaking out. My girlfriend's driving. She's like, what the hell is wrong with you? And I tell her, I was like, I'm a finalist. And she starts screaming, and the car is swerving. We survived. It's okay, but it was a very wild moment. And so then November 17th last year comes around. That's the night of the National Book Awards. So in a non-COVID year, the National Book Awards are a massive event. They fly you to New York, first class. You stay in a fancy hotel. You attend this dinner where like literally tickets are $1,200. Like people come out dressed in just black tie, you got red carpet, paparazzi, photographers, like Time magazine, everyone is there. Celebrities show up. It is the biggest event in writing. That's in a non-COVID year. I had a COVID year, and what that means is I got to drive 40 minutes to UNCW, sit in a cramped, musty old office that I was borrowing from one of the faculty, and sit and stare at my computer and do a Zoom call. Like that was my National Book Awards, where I had a very fancy suit up here and pajama bottoms down here. And again, people often think like you must, like, do they tell you ahead of time who actually won? Like, did you know? It's like, no. It is, you do not know who wins until they announce it. And that will come in very pivotal in our story as we progress here. But to prove to people like I really didn't know, my girlfriend asked, she said, do you want me to come with you and like be there and sit with you and like see what happens? And I was like, God, no. Like when I lose, I want to cry alone like a man. Like, what are you talking about? I said, I'll see you after or maybe tomorrow, but I want to cry by myself. Is how we do it. It's tradition. So I'm sitting there, and this is where it gets very dystopian and surreal. So they put us in, again, it's over Zoom, and there are 5 categories for National Book Award, and there are 5 finalists for each category. So they broke us up into these digital green rooms, what they call them. So each green room had one person from each category. So example, in my room, there's me, there's one person from poetry, translation, young adult, nonfiction. And we can all kind of see each other. And before the event, they come in our ear and they tell us, here's how it's going to work. Your category will be called, and when your category is called, your face will appear on the screen. They will announce the winner. If your name is called, congratulations. Stay on the line for about 30 seconds. They're going to talk about your book. They're going to explain why they chose it. They're going to like give you all your accolades, and then we'll cut to you, and you have an acceptance speech for like a minute or so, so be prepared for that. They said, if your name is not called, you are free to leave, is how they said it. Which is a very delicate way of saying, get your ass out of here, you lost. Which is a painful thing to say to someone. So here's what would happen. Fiction was the last category, so I got to watch this happen. They would say, in the National Book Award category for poetry, and then this lovely face would appear on my screen. And this person, like I can see them and they can see me, and they're staring at the camera, and we would hear it in their ear, and they would say, and the winner for the National Book Award for poetry is not this person. And they would just kind of hang there for a second, looking very shocked and stunned, and they just found out they didn't win the National Book Award. And after about 3 seconds, they just disappeared. They just went away. There was no goodbye, no wave at the camera. They just disappeared. And then they would say, they would move on. They would say, and now the category for translation. And here is another new face who looks very nervous because they just saw what happened to the last person. They would say, and the winner for the National Book Award for translation is not this person. And they would hang there for another 3 seconds, and they're gone. And it was just very dystopian and very weird. Like, I wondered, if you Google that person, do they still exist? Like, is there a history of them in all of humanity anymore? So I'm sitting there, and they finally get to, they said, and the category is creative nonfiction. And this face pops up. And they say, and the winner for creative nonfiction is Taya Miles. And her name was Taya Miles. And I was like, oh my God, what if my room won? So she's sitting there, and like, apparently she liked to cry alone in the dark too, because she was by herself. There was no one with her. And she's staring at the screen. And so at this moment, there's 30 seconds where, to the audience, they saw her book, they heard the people talking about her book, but they didn't see her. I was literally the first person on the planet to see her after she won the National Book Award. And I'm staring right at her, and she's staring at me. But I'm muted, so I couldn't really say congratulations. So in lieu of that, I just stared at my screen, and I started dancing. Finger guns, like everything to convey to her, you just won the National Book Award, congratulations. And she starts smiling and giggles a bit. And at the beginning of her National Book Award acceptance speech, if you Google it, you'll hear her say, before I begin, I would like to take a second to thank Jason Mott for helping me calm down after this moment of winning. And again, I had never met her before. Like, I still have not ever met her, but we had a cool bonding moment of me being silly. So then they get to my category, and suddenly my face appears, and it's very existential, because I'm looking at myself, wondering, did I live a good life? Because I may disappear after this next moment. And they say, and the winner for the National Book Award for fiction is, and there's this long pause. He says, hell of a book. And I thought, that's not my name. I just lost. Yeah, it was very sad. I was very heartbroken for about a few milliseconds when the synapses finally kicked in. And they were like, no, you don't. You just won the National Book Award. I started freaking out. It was so terrific, so amazing. My agent called while I was like still in this zone. Like, I have this voice message that I recorded, and I will always keep. It is my agent, her 5-year-old daughter, and her editing partner just screaming and crying for a full minute and a half. Like, there's very little words, there's a few pieces of words, but it's mostly just screaming and crying in happiness for a minute and a half. I think the 5-year-old was just crying because her mom suddenly started screaming and crying. So I think she was confused more than anything else. She told me later, she's like, yeah, I think I scared my daughter a little bit that night. Just like, yeah, that's fair. But yeah, so that is how you go from working at Verizon Wireless to winning the National Book Award. So now comes my personal favorite part of all this, when I get to turn it over to you all for questions. Because as I said, like, I know my backstory, but I do not know what you all would care to learn about. So please feel free to ask questions. It can be about the book, it can be about writing process, publishing, movies, video games, whatever you care to talk about.
Hi,
Hello.
my name's Mona. You don't care.
I do care. Tell me what I
Also,
care
you
about.
favorited my tweet last night, so thank you very much for that. I felt very special. Without giving it away for anyone who hasn't read the book, I want to talk about the invisibility concept that you weaved throughout the book. As a mother of a black man and a black woman, we were always trying to teach our children how to be invisible in society while also being true to themselves and all of that. But this was the first time that that concept had ever been made concrete in words, and I'm not done feeling things about it. So I want to talk about, like, what propelled you to write that idea and to put it into words that I think every black parent has done it subconsciously. It has never been made so clear for me, even as a parent, for us, for somebody to put it in a book. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I definitely can. Thank you. And I'm glad to hear that it had such an impact on you. That's always terrific to hear. So the invisibility began in two very separate places. So I grew up being the kid who was bullied on the bus a lot. Like, I was, people kind of engage with me now, and they're like, I can't believe you were ever. Yeah, I was definitely, because I was the quiet, nerdy kid who sat in the window seat and read all the time on the way to school, and read comic books before they were cool. Like when people used to beat you up for reading comics. That's the era I grew up in. So every day that I was being bullied, because I was and still am a really hardcore introvert. Like, I do not like being the center of attention. Like, I have learned to do it over the years. Like, but it's like tensing a muscle. Like, I can stand here and give a good show, hopefully a good show. But by the end of the night, when I get home to the hotel, like, I just pass out from exhaustion. So as I was being bullied as a kid, the one thought that I always had was, like, I always wished I could just disappear. Like, I wish they couldn't see me, because if they couldn't see you, they can't bully you. So I would be sitting on the bus, and I would try to read, and I would just make myself as small as possible next to the window and try not to have them see me. And I would just remember thinking, like, please don't see me, please don't see me. And of course, they always find you, because that's what bullies are good at. It's why they're bullies. So that was where some of the invisibility began. The other part begins with the way that black and brown parents have to conversate with their children about encountering society, not just police, but also society in general. Parents rarely tell their kids the express words, do not be seen. But what they do is they tell you in a roundabout way not to stand out too much. Don't have saggy pants, but don't dress this certain way. Don't wear this type of clothing. You can do a little hip-hop clothing, but don't wear too much. That'll get you noticed. My parents were very adamant about making sure that I could code switch. And for those who don't know, code switching is when you speak one way with, like, your family and cousins and friends, and then when you're in, like, a non-black space, you learn to speak another way, and you better do it very well. My parents made sure that I was able to be eloquent or articulate. They were so big on that, because that is a way of, like, reducing your blackness, reducing that visibility that may get you shot by a police officer. If you were pulled over, like, if a police officer stops you and you engage with police, you don't want your child to not have, like, you want your child to essentially be able to de-escalate the officer. If the officer starts escalating, you want your child to be able to de-escalate them through words and just by speaking to them. So you teach your child to kind of hide these massive parts of who they are and diminish them and make them smaller as a way of not standing out and not getting noticed, being invisible. So that was where that part of it came from, because, and it's not a conversation you have with your parents once, it's a conversation you have over their lifetime. You have a conversation when they're young, when they're teenagers, when they're late teens, early 20s, 30s, like, honestly, onward into like 40s and 50s, I'm sure, like, you have to have that conversation because the rules change and how you engage with it change. So that is where the invisibility, the exploration of that and the themes around that came from. And then there's other like smaller themes of me being like a writer who is very visible because I'm a black writer. Even if I'm not writing about race, I am always the black writer. My first novel, The Returned, it's about longing and grief and coping with like loss of people that you love. And yes, there's some small background stuff about like race and treating people that, you know, that are considered other as like people that we care about. But when I wrote that book, like I was immediately the black author. Like if there was ever a panel where they need a black author, they called me. And it's like, my book's not about race. We don't care you're black. You know about race. And it's like, well, yeah, but it don't mean I want to talk about it all the time. So there's that invisibility of, as an author, the parts of yourself are kind of reduced and you have to learn to navigate that. So that's a little bit about the invisibility. Does that help you at all? Awesome, thank you. Next question. Thank you. More questions? Oh, someone back there.
Hi, I'd like to first thank you for your help with my Verizon bill a few years ago. I think I did that.
You're very welcome.
I have a question about when you're writing and the book is in your head, whose voice do you hear telling the story? Is it your voice, the character's voice, or someone else?
It's typically the character's voice. I think most stories that I begin, they start with some character, and then I'll write about an idea that's centered around that character and just kind of explore that and see where it goes. My writing process is very messy. I will spend literally like a year or so just writing stuff. And I call it stuff because it's not connected. As I told you earlier, I had stuff about a writer, I had stuff about, you know, being black in America, and that became this novel. So like right now, I've got close to 500 pages of stuff. Some of it is experiences, some of it has to do with race, some of it doesn't, some of it has characters that I've thought up, and I thought it'd be really cool characters to write about, and they're in there too, but it's just a file on my computer of stuff. So it's a real mixture, but it typically begins with a character's voice, and then once I get a sense of who the character is and what the character wants, and maybe what they want to talk about, then I start trying to build the narrative around that. So yeah, that's how the story happens. Next question, and please don't be afraid. Gentleman back there.
Good afternoon. My question is for focused on young people. What impact, if any, have young people or the young perspective had on your writing, and what impact do you hope that your writing will have on young people?
Yeah, I hope this book is. So I kind of wrote this book, and I didn't know it at the time. I didn't figure it out until the book was almost finished. At some point in the process, I realized that what I was actually writing, you know, people tell you oftentimes, you know, what would you say to your younger self if you could? And so now when people ask me that, I tell them I would give them this book. I would give my younger self this book. Because the impact that I was trying to give to my younger self and the impact I hope to give to, like, you know, younger minorities, or just young kids in general, honestly, is the sense that, you know, it's okay to be different. It's okay to be the weird kid in the room. Like, you can still learn to love who you are. So much of the book is about learning to love who you are in spite of what others tell you, which I think is one of the hardest lessons to ever learn. Like, we spend our entire lives sometimes trying to figure that out and trying to learn to love who we are. And for me, I grew up very much hating who I was for years and years and years. I would probably say it's only fairly recently, maybe within the last 10 to 15 years, that I truly began to settle into and like learn to love who I am. I think that's part of the natural arc of, you know, life. You know, typically when you're like 40 or 50, like, you know who you are and you like yourself, hopefully. But that's kind of the impact I was hoping to have. And it's been great touring for the book because I've met so many like teenagers who have found the book and read the book and really loved it. And I think that's a really important thing because for me, again, I was the weird kid, and there aren't many weird books written about these topics and about learning to navigate these topics. When you're a black writer, you typically are expected to talk about things in a very solemn, straightforward, traditional sense. You can't be silly, you can't be absurdist, you can't put too many jokes, because it's not a joking matter. And that's true, but part of life in general is that if you do not learn to laugh at sorrow, you will not make it through this life. You have to learn that as a survival tactic. But I was never seeing that expressed in the literature that I read growing up, or even as an adult. There isn't really like a black Hunter S. Thompson. Like, you don't get to be absurdist and black at the same time as far as writers go. So my goal was to have this be the thing that young writers, when they encounter it, they can look at that and say, oh, it is doable. Like, here's a template for how, if I want to be absurdist and silly and still talk about very important topics, I'm allowed to do it because someone did it before and did okay with it. So that's some of my hopes for the impact of it. So yeah. Next question. These are good stuff.
So one of the things that I thought a lot about, and I think wonderful, thank you for writing it, was how the author, when he was asked what the book was about, he never could or maybe would say, and I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yes. So there's two different places that kind of came from, and kind of why I put that in there and plays it out. The first place is, like, as an author, that is the question you get asked more than anything. You get asked, what's your book about, so many times. And it's not, obviously, it's a fair question. Like, if you're on a plane and the person next to you says they're an author, you like, what do you ask? Oh, that's great. What kind of stuff do you write? What's your book about? Like, it's the question that you get. But when you've heard it literally several thousand times, like, it starts to, you start to have some feelings about it. So I wanted to poke fun at that, because that is one of the things about being a writer, that every author I know has that same kind of like, oh yeah, I've encountered that question a few times. So I was having fun with that. But then also, from a thematic standpoint and like a character narrative standpoint, the main character of the novel, this author, who becomes known simply as the author, never is given a hard defined name. He has some trauma and some experiences in his life that he has not dealt with, and he essentially has been hiding from them throughout most of his life. And when you encounter him in the novel, he's still hiding from that thing, that trauma, that moment that has impacted his life so dramatically. And so that's the reason why whenever someone asks him, hey, what's your book about? Before he could answer, like, I made sure that we cut away to something else. Like, we're never giving that sense of, like, what the book is. Because the author in the novel is very aware of the reader. Like, the author knows the reader is there. So if the author gives you a scene where he finally tells someone what the book is about, that means he has to talk about it. He has to process that pain and that trauma. He has to have that discussion. And he doesn't want to have that discussion yet. And so every time, because again, he knows the reader is there, he doesn't want to tell you his thing yet. He doesn't want to dredge up all of that yet. So he makes sure to kind of cut away and to move on to something else, and something else happens. So that's why there's that constant, like, pulling away from finding out what it is. And it's funny because when I was writing it, I was really nervous because I said, this is going to frustrate some readers. Some readers would be cool with it. Other readers will hate the fact that he keeps doing this. And at some point, you have to just decide to cut your losses. Like, you can't please everyone, so you got to pick one, pick your poison. So I was like, well, I'm going to do it. Because, again, I thought no one would read the book. So I said, for me, I know what the book's about, so I'm fine with it. So I left it in there and kind of really played it up. And it was also fun. Like, I love movies. I love movies and books that recognize I am there and I'm an intelligent, like, agent encountering this thing, so treat me intelligently. And to me, that was a fun tongue-in-cheek of, like, I know that you want to know what this thing is about, but since I know that you want to know, I'm not going to tell you. And I know you can see me not telling you, and that conversation was part of the fun of writing it. It was important to me that I had fun during the act of writing, otherwise I would never have been able to finish it, quite frankly. So yeah. There's a microphone coming to you, and then gentleman in the back next.
Hi.
Hi.
I just wanted to tell you that this is one of the best books I've ever read.
Awesome, thank you.
It really is. It really is. And you have a real gift for writing.
Thank you.
A real gift, and I could feel the poetry in here too.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's prose, but there's poetic stuff in here, which I think is wonderful. I laughed, I cried, I laughed, I cried. I had all these different emotions, and on page 239 is when I really bawled. And that was when Paul was telling Soot that, I'm so sorry you were born into this. That really made me feel very, very emotional. So I just wanted to tell you, it's not a question, it's just I wanted to tell
Well,
you
thank you.
what I feel about your book.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I think the gentleman back there in the back had a question next.
This will be our last
Okay,
question.
last question. All right.
Well, you mentioned frustrating the readers. You not only frustrated me, but you made me angry, you know, being a black man and having to hear about all these black shootings by white police officers. And there's a certain amount of vilification and anger toward the police. But you made me bring them into a human contact. Your conversation, the conversation that the officer was having with the writer about having a family of his own, not really wanting to shoot anybody, wanting to be understood. It humanized the person, and I had to let go of some of my anger.
Awesome.
That's it.
Terrific. Thank you. That's beautiful. Yeah, and I would love to talk about that moment because that's probably one of the moments that I kind of get asked about. People have some very strong feelings about that. So, and again, it's going to spoil a little bit for some readers, but hopefully it doesn't do too much harm. Hopefully you guys still appreciate it. So that moment when the author encounters this police officer who's been involved in the shooting, I've had readers who came up to me afterwards who had the exact opposite reaction to you. I've had readers who encountered me and they were angry that I humanized this police officer who was involved in the shooting. And they, people oftentimes ask, why did you do that? Why did you choose to humanize this person and make them, sympathetic? And it's because that is what I want the police to do when they see me. I want them to humanize me. I do not want them to reduce me to a stereotype and to an image, a figure that they are inherently or systematically taught to be afraid of and to kind of suspect. Like one of the FBI crime statistics, statistics regarding police is if you have an unarmed white suspect and an unarmed black suspect, the unarmed black suspect is 6 times more likely to be shot when engaging with police officers. And again, I am talking about unarmed in both cases. It's not that one of them had a bat or a knife. No, completely unarmed. The only difference is the color of their skin. The black suspect is 6 times more likely to be shot by police officers. And that comes from a lack of humanization. That comes from a lack of seeing people as more than just, something in a document, something in a statistic, whatever the stereotype is of black people, the black males in particular in America, is a problem. And so, because I want that for myself, I could not deny it to the character in the book. Because again, the whole book is about learning to see people in their entirety for who they are. So if I want to write a book where my goal is to make sure that police officers and legislators and judges and just America sees black people for their wholeness, I could not be a hypocrite and then suddenly paint this character as just the evil white cop. Because believe it or not all cops do make bad decisions. I would argue they are a minority. There's still a majority issue of systemic institutionalized teaching of how we teach cops to handle minorities, but that's another discussion. Cops themselves are not evil people. They're underpaid and overworked, quite frankly. They have too many tasks that they're assigned to do, too many things that they're required to do. And that's a societal flaw. That's our flaw as a group, that we haven't fixed this. So again, the goal was, and the necessity was, I have to humanize this person because they are a person first, and they're a cop second. And yes, they committed this terrible act, but people commit terrible acts all the time in their lives, and oftentimes it is a one-off. People do hit and runs, people do, just terrible car accidents where someone loses their life. And before that, this person lived a completely normal, fine, upstanding life, and they had this one terrible moment. And their entire life is judged for that afterwards. And I don't think that's necessarily fair. Sometimes it is, but usually it isn't. So that is why I put so much work into really trying to humanize that officer, because again, if I want others to humanize me, I've got to give them the same respect. I have to give that back. So that's where that came from. And again, thank you all for coming out. I hope you had a great time.
On behalf of Central Library and FFRPL, we'd like to thank all of you for coming, and of course, thanks to our special guest, Jason Mott. We will have Writers and Books has a table in the back. They will be selling copies of Jason's. You are welcome, if you brought your own books to have signed, you're welcome to line up against this wall. You're also welcome to purchase from Writers and Books at the back table. Again, please line up against this side wall to have your books signed, and then you can exit from the doors directly behind the book signing table. Thank you all again.